Oh, hello, everybody. I'm Mikhail, and I've got some stories I want to share with you. All right. Let me just grab a seat here with everyone. I'm here with my lovely partner, Katie, at her place here in quarantined, occupied Olone land. Welcome, everyone. This is the 6th volume of Quarantine Bedtime Storytime. This is a bonus Borges edition. I've been meaning to read more Borges, and I've been neglecting it a little bit, so we're just gonna do pure Borges tonight. I want to thank everyone, first of all, for lending me their time, their ears, your computer connection, your electricity. I'm very happy to be here lending you my time and my voice and my love for literature, and especially for Borges. He's actually my favorite author. This book, Collected Fictions by Jorge Luis Borges, is probably the one book that, at least when I was going to school studying literature, this was my favorite book. It's still one of my favorites, although I've been reading a lot of different things that have been really interesting. His short stories are his best. I don't think Borges ever wrote a novel, although he claimed to have read 10,000 books in his life. He was from Argentina, very interesting guy. In fact, let me just share the Wikipedia here in case anyone wants any more information about him. But I know a couple people out there love Borges, so we're going to get into that. I want to wish everyone good health during these uncertain times, and I'm hoping that everyone is keeping their connections with everyone alive. That's what this is all about, reading to y'all so that we get connected. So I want you to also come back at me. Since I shared with you that Borges is my favorite author, please share with me who is your favorite author, just so we can connect a little bit and share what we like about literature. I have the physical copy here, of course, sticking to that. Last thing I want to say is I've been considering putting these videos all up on a YouTube channel. Of course, I want to share this with everyone as much as possible. And also, like I said, I'm on top of promoting the literature and promoting the connection. I'm also just trying to keep myself busy during quarantine times. I used to spend a lot more time in big groups of people, and now I'm happy to have everyone gathered around the fire here. So anyways, hey, Jasmine, I'm glad to see my family here. I know I got some cousins who have been enjoying this. So let's, without further ado, for volume 6, let's get to some Borges. This first story I'm going to read is called Hakim, the Masked Dyer of Merv. And as a note, it says, for Angelica Ocampo. I'm going to do my best with the Spanish pronunciation, but on top of some Spanish, this isn't the English translation, but on top of some Spanish in here, there's a lot of different languages. I think there's a lot of Arabic in this story, so bear with me on the translations. I'm going to do my best for you guys. And it begins. Unless I am mistaken, the original sources of information on Al-Mokana, the veiled, or more strictly masked prophet of Khorasan, are but 4. A. The excerpts from the history of the caliphs, preserved by Baladuri. B. The manual of the giant, or book of precision and revision, by the official historians of the Abbasids. Ibn Abi Tahir Tarfur. C. The Arabic codex entitled The Annihilation of the Rose, which refutes the abominable heresies of the Rosa Obscura, or Rosa Secreta, which was the prophet's holy work. And D. Several coins, without portraits, unearthed by an engineer named Andrusov, on ground that had been leveled for the Trans-Caspian Railway. These coins were deposited in the Numismatic Museum in Tehran. They contain Persian distichs which summarize or correct certain passages from the Annihilation. The original Rosa has apparently been lost since the manuscript found in 1899 and published, not without haste, by the Morgenländisches Morgenländisches Archiv was declared by Horn and later by Sir Percy Skies to be apocryphal. The fame of the prophet in the West is owed to Thomas More's garrulous poem Lalla Rookh, a work laden with the Irish conspirators' sighs and longing for the East. In the year 120 of the Hegida, or 736 of the Christian era, there was born in Turkestan the man Hakim, whom people of that time and of that region were to call the Veiled. His birthplace was the ancient city of Merv, whose gardens and vineyards and lawns look out sadly onto the desert. Noontime there, when not obscured by choking clouds of sand and that leave a film of whitish dust on the black clusters of grapes, is white and dazzling. Hakim was raised in that wearied city. We know that one of his father's brothers trained him as a dyer, the craft known to be a refuge for infidels and impostors and inconstant men, which inspired the first anathemas of his extravagant career. My face is of gold, a famous page of the Annihilation says, but I have steeped the purple dye, and on the second night have plunged the uncarded wool into it, and on the third night have saturated the prepared wool, and the emperors of the islands still contend for that bloody cloth. Thus did I sin in the years of my youth, deforming the colors of the creatures. The angel would tell me that lambs were not the color of tigers, while Satan would tell me that the all-powerful one desired that they be. And in that pursuit, he employed my cunning and my dye. Now I know that neither the angel nor Satan spoke the truth, for I know that all color is abominable. In the year 146 of the Hegida, Hakim disappeared from his native city. The vats and barrels in which he had immersed the cloth were broken, as were a scimitar from Shiraz and a brass mirror. At the end of the moon of Shaban in the year 158, the air of the desert was very clear, and a group of men were looking toward the west in expectation of the moon of Ramadan, which inspires fasting and mortification. They were slaves, beggars, horse sellers, camel thieves, and butchers. Sitting gravely on the ground before the gate of an inn, at which caravans stopped on the road to Merv, they awaited the sign. They looked at the setting sun, and the color of the setting sun was the color of the sand. From far out on the dizzying desert, whose sun gives men fever and whose moon brings on convulsions, they saw three figures, apparently of immense height, coming towards them. The three figures were human, but the one in the center possessed the head of a bull. As these figures came closer, the man in the center was seen to be wearing a mask, while the two men that accompanied him were blind. Someone, as in the tales of the 1001 Nights, asked the reason for this wonder. They are blind, the masked man said, because they have looked upon my face. The historian of the Abbasids relates that the man from the desert, whose voice was extraordinarily sweet, or so, in contrast to the harshness of the mask it seemed to be, told the men that though they were awaiting the sign of a month of penitence, he would be for them a greater sign, the sign of an entire life of penitence, and a calumniated death. He told them that he was Hakim, son of Osman, and that in the year 146 of the flight, a man had entered his house, and after purifying himself and praying, had cut his Hakim's head off with a scimitar and taken it up to the heavens. Born in the right hand of this visitor, who was the angel Gabriel, his head had been taken before the Almighty, who had bade him prophecy, entrusting him with the words of such antiquity that speaking them burned one's mouth and endowed one with such glorious resplendence that mortal eyes could not bear to look upon it. That was the reason for his mask. When every man on earth professed the new law, the visage would be unveiled to them, and they would be able to worship it without danger, as the angels did already. His message delivered, Hakim exhorted the men to jihad, a holy war, and the martyrdom that accompanied it. The slaves, beggars, horse sellers, camel thieves, and butchers denied him their belief. One voice cried, "Sorcerer!" Another, "Impostor." Someone had brought a leopard, perhaps a member of that lithe and bloodthirsty breed trained by Persian huntsmen. At any rate, it broke free of its cage. Save for the masked prophet and his two acolytes, all the men there trampled one another in their haste to flee. When they returned, the beast was blind. In the presence of those luminous dead eyes, the men worshipped Hakim and admitted his supernatural estate. The official historian of the Abbasids relates that, with no great enthusiasm, the inroads made by Hakim the Veiled in Khorasan. That province, greatly moved by the misfortune and crucifixion of its most famous leader, embraced with desperate fervor the doctrine offered by the shining visage, and offered up to him its blood and gold. Hakim by now had exchanged his harsh mask for a fourfold veil of white silk embroidered with precious stones. Black was the symbolic color of the caliphs of the house of Abbas. Hakim chose the color white, the most distant from it, for his shielding veil, his banners, and his turbans. The campaign began well. It is true that in the Book of Precision, it is the caliph's pennants, the caliph's pennant that are victorious everywhere. But since the most frequent result of those victories is the stripping of the generals of their ranks and the abandonment of impregnable castles, it is not difficult for the sagacious leader to read between the lines. Toward the end of the moon of Rajab, in the year 161, the famous city of Nishapur opened its gates to the masked one. In early 162, the city of Astarabad did likewise. Hakim's military operations, like those of another, more fortunate prophet, were limited to his tenor chanting of prayers offered up to the deity from the hump of a reddish-colored camel in the chaotic heart of battle. Arrows would whistle all around him, yet he was never wounded. He seemed to seek out danger. The night a band of loathsome lepers surrounded his palace, he had them brought to him. He kissed them, and he made them gifts of gold and silver. The prophet delegated the wary details of governing to 6 or 7 adepts. He was a scholar of meditation and of peace. A harem of 114 blind wives attempted to satisfy the needs of his divine body. So long as their words did not altogether contravene orthodox belief, confidential friends of God are tolerated by Islam, however indiscreet or threatening to that religion they may be. The prophet would perhaps not have spurned the advantages of that neglect, but his followers, his victories, and the public wrath of the caliph, whose name was Muhammad al-Mahdi, forced him into heresy. It was that descent that ruined him, though first it led him to set down the articles of a personal religion that bore the clear influence of Gnostic forebearers. In the beginning of Hakim's cosmogony, there was a spectral god, a deity as majestically devoid of origins as of name and face. This deity was an immutable god, but is an image through 9 shadows. These, condescending to action, endowed and ruled over a first heaven. From that first demiurgic crown there came a second, and its own angels, powers, and thrones. And these in turn founded another, lower heaven, which was a symmetrical duplicate of the first. The second conclave was reproduced in a third, and the third in another lower conclave, and so on, to the number of 999 heavens. The Lord of the nethermost heaven, the shadow of shadows of yet other shadows, is he who reigns over us, and his fraction of divinity tends to 0. The earth we inhabit is an error, an incompetent parody. Mirrors and paternity are abominable because they multiply and affirm it. Revulsion, disgust, is the fundamental virtue. The 2 rules of of conduct, between which the prophet left men free to choose, led us to it. Abstinence and utter licentiousness, the indulgence of the flesh, or the chastening of it. Hakim's paradise and hell were no less desperate. To those who deny the word, to those who deny the jeweled veil and the visage, runs an imprecation from the Rosa Secreta. I vow a wondrous hell, for each person who so denies shall reign over 999 empires of fire, and in each empire shall be 999 mountains of fire, and upon each mountain there shall be 999 towers of fire, and each tower shall have 999 stories of fire, and each story shall have 999 beds of fire, and in each bed shall that person be, and 999 kinds of fire, each with its own face and voice, shall torture that person throughout eternity. Another passage corroborates this. Here in this life dost thou suffer one body. In death and retribution thou shalt have bodies innumerable. Paradise was less concrete. It is always night, and there are fountains of stone, and the happiness of that paradise is the special happiness of farewells, of renunciation, and of those who know that they are sleeping. In the 163rd year of the Hagira, the 5th of the shining face, Hakim was surrounded in Sanam by the caliph's army. Great were the provisions, many the martyrs, and aid from a horde of angels of light was expected at any moment. Such was the pass to which they had overcome, that they had come, when a terrifying rumor spread through the castle. It was said that as an adulteress within the harem was being strangled by the eunuchs, she had screamed that the third finger was missing from the prophet's right hand, and that his other fingers had no nails. The rumor spread like fire among the faithful. In broad daylight, standing upon a high terrace, Hakim prayed to his familiar God for victory, or for a sign. Servilely, with their heads bowed, as though they were running against the rain, 2 captains snatched away the gem-embroidered veil. First there came a trembling. The promised face of the apostle, the face which had journeyed to the heavens, was indeed white, but it was white with the whiteness of leprosy. It was so swollen, or so incredible, that it seemed to be a mask. It had no eyebrows. The lower eyelid of the right eye drooped upon the senile cheek. A dangling cluster of nodular growths was eating away its lips. The flat and inhuman nose resembled that of a lion. Hakim's voice attempted one final deception. "Thy abominable sins forbid thee to look upon my radiance," he began. No one was listening. He was riddled with spears. Whew! What a story. I'm going to go back to one line because this is such an interesting line. The earth we inhabit is an error, an incompetent parody. Mirrors and paternity are abominable because they multiply and affirm it. What a crazy line. So this false prophet seems like he may have contracted leprosy at some point, but the whole time was pretending that his face was just, his face was so radiant that people would die if they looked upon it. But indeed, when people looked upon it, he died, which is interesting. Borges' writing is beautiful. I wish I could read it in the original Spanish. I feel like it might be a little bit challenging because the English is so challenging, but one day I'll get there. I'm going to move on to a story, The Garden of Forking Paths. This story I did read when I was studying literature in college. Very useful degree. Although I did study German and was able to read in German, Spanish was not the language that I chose at that time. So now I'm regretting the degree, and I'm regretting not studying Spanish more. That was a good opportunity. Anyways, let's move on with some more Spanish literature, some of the original magic realist literature, postmodern literature that prefigured and underpins a lot of magic realist literature. This story is about a book, which is a common theme for Borges. The Garden of Forking Paths for Victoria Ocampo. On page 242 of the History of the World War, Little Heart tells us that an Allied offensive against the Serre-Montauban line, to be mounted by 13 British divisions backed by 1,400 artillery pieces, had been planned for July 24, 1916, but had to be put off until the morning of the 29th. Torrential rains, notes Captain Little Heart, were the cause of that delay, a delay that entailed no great consequences, as it turns out. The statement which follows, dictated, reread, and signed by Dr. Yu Tsun, former professor of English in the Hochschule at Qingdao, throws unexpected light on the case. The two first pages of the statement are missing. Just a note, the Hochschule at Qingdao, you might recognize Qingdao as the Chinese beer that's sold here. It comes from, I think, what was either a trade colony or an actual administrative colony of the Germans in China. So this Chinese professor taught English at a German school at a Chinese city. Anyways, this is his statement. And I hung up the receiver. Immediately afterwards, I recognized the voice that had answered in German. It was that of Captain Richard Madden. Madden's presence in Victor Runeberg's flat meant the end of our efforts, and though this seemed to me quite secondary, or should have seemed, our lives as well. It meant that Runeberg had been arrested or murdered. Before the sun set on that day, I would face the same fate. Madden was implacable, or rather, he was obliged to be implacable. An Irishman at the orders of the English, a man accused of a certain lack of zealousness, perhaps even treason, how could he fail to embrace and give thanks for this miraculous favor? The discovery, capture, perhaps death of two agents of the German Empire. I went upstairs to my room. Absurdly, I locked the door, and then I threw myself on my back onto my narrow iron bed. Outside the window were the usual rooftops and the overcast 6 o'clock sun. I found it incredible that this day, lacking all omens and premonitions, should be the day of my implacable death. Despite my deceased father, despite my having been a child in a symmetrical garden in Haifeng, was I now about to die? Then I reflected that all things happen to oneself, and happen precisely now. Century follows century, yet events occur only in the present. Countless men in the air, on the land and sea, yet everything that truly happens to me. The almost unbearable story of Madden's horsey face demolition of those mental ramblings. In the midst of my hatred and my terror, now I don't mind talking about terror. Now that I have foiled Richard Madden, now that my neck hungers for the rope, it occurred to me that the brawling and undoubtedly happy warrior did not suspect that I possessed the secret, the name of the exact location of the new British artillery park on the Ancre. A bird furrowed the gray sky, and I blindly translated it into an airplane, and that aeroplane into many, in the French sky, annihilating the artillery park with vertical bombs. If only my throat, before a bullet crushed it, could cry out that name so that it might be heard in Germany. But my human voice was so terribly inadequate. How was I to make it reach the leader's ear? The ear of that sick and hateful man who knew nothing of Runeberg and me, save that we were in Staffordshire, and who was vainly awaiting word from us in his arid office in Berlin, poring infinitely through the newspapers. I must flee, I said aloud. I sat up noiselessly, in needless but perfect silence, as though Madden were already outside my door. Something, perhaps the mere show of proving that my resources were non-existent, made me go through my pockets. I found what I knew I would find: the American watch, the nickel-plated chain and quadrangular coin, the key ring with the compromising and useless keys to Runeberg's flat, the notebook, a letter I resolved to destroy at once and never did, the false passport, 1 crown, 2 shillings, and a few odd pence, the red and blue pencil, the handkerchief, the revolver with its single bullet. Absurdly, I picked it up and hefted it to give myself courage. I vaguely reflected that a pistol shot can be heard at a considerable distance. In 10 minutes, my plan was right. The telephone book gave me the name of the only person able to communicate the information. He lived in a suburb of Fenton, less than half an hour away by train. I am a coward. I can say that, now that I have carried out a plan whose dangerousness and daring no man will deny. I know that it was a terrible thing to do. I did not do it for Germany. What do I care for a barbaric country that has forced me to the ignominy of spying? Furthermore, I know of a man of England, a modest man, who in my view is no less a genius than Goethe. I spoke with him for no more than an hour, but for 1 hour he was Goethe. No, I did it because I sensed that the leader looked down on the people of my race, the countless ancestors whose blood flows through my veins. I wanted to prove to him that a yellow man could save his armies. And I had to escape from Madden. His hands, his voice, could beat upon my door at any moment. I silently dressed and said goodbye to myself in the mirror, made my way downstairs, looked up and down the quiet street, and set off. The train station was not far from my flat, and I thought it better to take a cab. I argued that I ran less chance of being recognized that way. The fact is, I felt I was visible and vulnerable, infinitely vulnerable, in the deserted street. I recall that I told the driver to stop a little ways from the main entrance to the station. I got down from the cab with willed and almost painful slowness. I would be going to the village of Ash Grove, but I bought a ticket for a station further down the line. The train was to leave at 8:50, scant minutes away. I had to hurry. The next train would not be until 9:30. There was almost no one on the platform. I walked through the cars. I recall a few workmen, a woman dressed in mourning weeds, a young man fervently reading Tacitus's Annals, and a cheerful-looking wounded soldier. The train pulled out at last. A man I recognized ran vainly out to the end of the platform. It was Captain Richard Madden. Shattered, trembling, I huddled on the other end of the seat, far from the feared window. From that shattered state, I passed into a state of almost abject cheerfulness. I told myself that my duel had begun, and that in dodging my adversary's thrust even by 40 minutes, even thanks to the slightest smile from fate, the first round had gone to me. I argued that this small win prefigured total victory. I argued that the win was not really even so small, since without the precious hour that the trains had given me, I'd be in jail or dead. I argued, no less sophistically, that my cowardly cheerfulness proved that I was a man capable of following this adventure through to its successful end. From that weakness, I drew strength that was never to abandon me. I foresee that mankind will resign itself more and more fully every day to more and more horrendous undertakings. And soon there will be nothing but warriors and brigands. I give them this piece of advice. He who is to perform a horrendous act should imagine himself that it is already done, should impose upon himself a future as irrevocable as the past. That is what I did, while my eyes, the eyes of a man already dead, registered the flow of that day perhaps to be my last, and the spreading of the night. The train ran sweetly, gently through the woods of ash trees. It stopped virtually in the middle of the countryside. No one called out the name of the station. Ashgrove, I asked some boy on the platform. Ash Grove, they said, nodding. I got off the train. A lamp illuminated the platform, but the boys' faces remained within the area of the shadows. Are you going to Dr. Stephen Albert's house? One queried. Without waiting for an answer, another of them said, the house is a far way, but you'll not get lost if you follow that road there to the left and turn left at every crossing. I tossed them a coin, my last, went down some stone steps, and started down the solitary road. It ran ever so slightly downhill and was of elemental dirt. Branches tangled overhead, and the low, round moon seemed to walk along beside me. For one instant, I feared that Richard Madden had somehow seen through my desperate plan, but I soon realized that that was impossible. The boy's advice to turn always to the left reminded me that that was the common way of discovering the central lawn of a certain type of maze. I am something of a connoisseur of mazes. Not for nothing am I the great-grandson of Chu Pen, who was governor of Yunnan province, and who renounced all temporal power in order to write a novel containing more characters than the Hung Lu Men, and construct a labyrinth in which all men would lose their way. Cui Pen devoted 13 years to those desperate labors, but the hand of a foreigner murdered him, and his novel made no sense, and no one ever found the labyrinth. I pictured it perfectly and inviolate on the secret summit of a mountain. I pictured its outlines blurred by rice paddies or underwater. I pictured it as infinite, a labyrinth not of octagonal pavilions and paths that turn back upon themselves, but of rivers and provinces and kingdoms. I imagined a labyrinth of labyrinths, a maze of mazes, a twisting, turning, ever-widening labyrinth that contained both past and future and somehow implied the stars. Absorbed in those illusory imaginings, I forgot that I was a pursued man. I felt myself, for an indefinite while, the abstract perceiver of the world. The vague living countryside, the moon, the remains of the day did their work in me. So did the gently downward road, which forestalled all possibility of weariness. The evening was near, yet infinite. The road dropped and forked as it cut through the now formless meadows. A keen and vaguely syllabic song, blurred by leaves and distance, came and went in the gentle gusts of the breeze. I was struck by the thought that a man may be the enemy of other men, the enemy of other men's other moments, yet not be the enemy of a country, of fireflies, words, gardens, watercourses, zephyrs. It was amidst such thoughts that I came to a high, rusty gate. Through the iron bars, I made out a drive lined with poplars and a gazebo of some kind. Suddenly, I realized two things. The first trivial, the second almost incredible. The music I had heard was coming from the gazebo or pavilion, and the music was Chinese. That was why, unconsciously, I had fully given myself over to it. I do not recall whether there was a bell or whether I had to clap my hands to make my arrival known. The sputtering of the music continued, but from the rear of the intimate house, a lantern was making its way towards me. A lantern crosshatched and sometimes blotted out altogether by the trees. A paper lantern, the shape of a drum and the color of the moon. It was carried by a tall man. I could not see his face because the light blinded me. He opened the gate and slowly spoke to me in my own language. I see that the compassionate Si Peng has undertaken to remedy my solitude. You will no doubt wish to see the garden. I recognized the name of one of our consuls, but I could only disconcertedly repeat, the garden? The garden of forking paths. Something stirred in my memory, and I spoke with incomprehensible assurance. The garden of my ancestor Cui Pen. Your ancestor? Your illustrious ancestor? Please, come in. The dew-drenched path meandered like the paths of my childhood. We came to a library of Western and Oriental books. I recognized, bound in yellow silk, several handwritten volumes of the lost encyclopedia compiled by the third emperor of the Luminous dynasty, but never printed. The disc on the gramophone revolved near a bronze phoenix. I also recall a vase of famille rose, and another, earlier by several hundred years, of that blue color our artificers copied from the potters of ancient Persia. Stephen Albert, with a smile, regarded me. He was, as I have said, quite tall, with sharp features, gray eyes, and a gray beard. There was something priest-like about him, somehow, but something sailor-like as well. Later he told me he had been a missionary in Tianjin before aspiring to be a sinologist, someone who studies Chinese culture. We sat down, I on a long low divan, he with his back to the window and a tall circular clock. I figured that my pursuer, Richard Madden, could not possibly arrive for at least an hour. My irrevocable decision could wait. An amazing life, Cui Pens, Albert said, governor of the province in which he had been born, a man learned in astrology, astronomy, and the unwearying interpretations of canonical books, a chess player, a renowned poet, a calligrapher. He abandoned it all in order to compose a book and a labyrinth. He renounced the pleasures of oppression, justice, the populous marriage bed, banquets, and even erudition in order to sequester himself for 13 years in the pavilion of limpid solitude. Upon his death, his heirs found nothing but chaotic manuscripts. The family, as you perhaps are aware, were about to deliver them to the fire, but his counselor, a Taoist or Buddhist monk, insisted upon publishing them. To this day, I replied, we who are descended from Cui Pen execrate that monk. It was senseless to publish those manuscripts. The book is a contradictory jumble of irresolute drafts. I once examined it myself. In the 3rd chapter, the hero dies, yet in the 4th he is alive again. As for Cui Pen's other labor, his labyrinth, here is his labyrinth, Albert said, gesturing towards a tall, lacquered writing cabinet. An ivory labyrinth, I exclaimed. A very small sort of labyrinth. A labyrinth of symbols, he corrected me. An invisible labyrinth of time. I, an English barbarian, have somehow been chosen to unveil the diaphanous mystery. Now, more than 100 years after the fact, the precise details are irrecoverable, but it is not difficult to surmise what happened. Cui Pen must at one point have remarked, I shall retire to write a book, and at another point, I shall retire to construct a labyrinth. Everyone pictured 2 projects. It occurred to no one that book and labyrinth were one and the same. The pavilion of limpid solitude was erected in the center of a garden that was perhaps most intricately laid out. That fact might well have suggested a physical labyrinth. Cui Pen died. No one in all the wide lands that had been his could find the labyrinth. The novel's confusedness, of course, suggests to me that it was that labyrinth. 2 circumstances lent me the final solution of the problem. 1, the curious legend that Cui Pen had intended to construct a labyrinth, which was truly infinite, and 2, a fragment of a letter I discovered. Albert stood. His back was turned to me for several moments. He opened a drawer in the black and gold writing cabinet. He turned back with a paper that had once been crimson, but was now pink and delicate and rectangular. It was written in Cui Pen's renowned calligraphy. Eagerly, yet uncomprehendingly, I read the words that a man of my own lineage had written with painstaking brushstrokes. I leave to several futures, but not all, my garden of forking paths. I wordlessly handed the paper back to Albert. He continued, before unearthing this letter, I had wondered how a book could be infinite. The only way I could surmise was that it be a cyclical or circular volume, a volume whose last page would be identical to the first, so that one might go on indefinitely. I also recalled that night in the center of the 1001 Nights, when the Queen Scheherazade, through some magical distractedness on the part of the copyist, begins to retell verbatim the story of the 1001 Nights, with the risk of returning once again to the night on which he is telling it, and so on ad infinitum. I also pictured to myself a Platonic hereditary sort of work, passed down from father to son, in which each new individual would add a chapter, or with reverent care correct his elder's pages. These imaginings amused and distracted me, but none of them seemed to correspond even remotely to Tsui Pen's contradictory chapters. As I was floundering about in the mire of these perplexities, I was sent from Oxford the document you have just examined. I paused, as you may well imagine, at the sentence, I leave to several futures, but not all, my garden of forking paths. Almost instantly I saw it. The garden of forking paths was the chaotic novel. The phrase, several futures, not all, suggested to me the image of a forking in time rather than space. A full rereading of the book confirmed my theory. In all fictions, each time a man meets diverse alternatives, he chooses one and eliminates the other. In the work of the virtually impossible to disentangle Tsui Pen, the character chooses simultaneously all of them. He creates thereby several futures, several times, which themselves proliferate and fork. That is the explanation for the novel's contradictions. Fang, let us say, has a secret. A stranger knocks at his door. Fang decides to kill him. Naturally, there are various possible outcomes. Fang can kill the intruder can kill Fang, they can both live, they can both be killed, and so on. In Tsui Pen's novels, all the outcomes, in fact, occur. Each is the starting point for further bifurcations. Once in a while, the paths of that labyrinth converge. For example, you come to this house, but in one of the possible paths, you are my enemy. In another, you are my friend. If you can bear my incorrigible pronunciation, we shall read a few pages. I'm excited about that. Let's read some pages. His face in the vivid circle of the lamp was undoubtedly that of an old man, though with something indomitable and even immortal about it. He read with slow precision two versions of a single epic chapter. In the first, an army marches off to battle through a mountain wilderness. The horror of the rocks and darkness inspires in them a disdain for life, and they go on to an easy victory. In the second, the same army passes through a palace in which a ball is being held. The brilliant battle seems to them a continuation of the fete, and they win it easily. I listened with honorable veneration to those ancient fictions, which were themselves perhaps not as remarkable as the fact that a man of my blood had invented them, and a man of a distant empire was restoring them to me on an island in the West in the course of a desperate mission. I recall the final words, repeated in each version like some secret commandment. Thus the heroes fought, their admirable hearts calm, their swords violent, they themselves resigned to killing and to dying. From that moment on, I felt all about me and within my obscure body an invisible, intangible pullulation, not that of the divergent parallel and finally coalescing armies, but an agitation more inaccessible, more inward than that. Yet one those armies somehow prefigured. Albert went on. I do not believe that your venerable ancestor played at idle variations. I cannot think it probable that he would sacrifice 13 years to the infinite performance of a rhetorical exercise. In your country, the novel is a subordinate genre. At that time, it was a genre beneath contempt. Tsui Pen was a novelist of genius, but he was also a man of letters, and surely would not have considered himself a mere novelist. The testimony of his contemporaries proclaims his metaphysical, mystical leanings, and his life is their fullest confirmation. Philosophical debates consumes a good part of his novel. I know that of all problems, none disturbed him, none gnawed at him, like the unfathomable problem of time. How strange, then, that the problem should be the only one that does not figure in the pages of his garden. He never uses the word. How do you explain that willful omission? Never uses the word time. I proposed several solutions, all unsatisfactory. We discussed them, finally. Albert said, "In a riddle whose answer is chess, what is the only word that must not be used?" I thought for a moment. "The word chess?" I replied. "Exactly," Albert said. "The Garden of Forking Paths is a huge riddle or parable, whose subject is time. That secret purpose forbids Tsui Pen the merest mention of its name. To always omit one word, to employ awkward metaphors and obvious circumlocutions, is perhaps the most emphatic way of calling attention to that word. It is at any rate the tortuous path chosen by the devious Tsui Pen at each and every one of the turnings of his inexhaustible novel. I have compared hundreds of manuscripts. I have corrected the errors introduced through the negligence of copyists. I have reached a hypothesis for the plan of that chaos. I have reestablished, or believe I've reestablished, its fundamental order. I have translated the entire work, and I know that not once does the word time appear. The explanation is obvious. The Garden of Forking Paths is an incomplete, but not false, image of the universe as conceived by Tsui Pen. Unlike Newton and Schopenhauer, your ancestor did not believe in a uniform and absolute time. He believed in an infinite series of times, a growing, dizzying web of divergent, convergent, and parallel times. That fabric of times that approach one another forth, are snipped off, or are simply unknown for centuries, contain all possibilities. In most of those times, we do not exist. In some, you exist, but I do not. In others, I do, and you do not. In others, still, we both do. In this one, which the favoring hand of chance has dealt me, you have come to my house. In another, when you come through my garden, you find me dead. In another, I say these same words, but I am an error, a ghost. In all I said, not without a tremble, I am grateful for, and I venerate your recreation of the Garden of Tsui Pen. Not in all, he whispered with a smile, time forks, perpetually into countless futures. In one of them, I am your enemy. I felt again that pullulation I have mentioned. I sensed that the dew-drenched garden that surrounded the house was saturated, infinitely, with invisible persons. Those persons were Albert and myself, secretly, busily at work, multiform, in another dimension of time. I raised my eyes and the gossamer nightmare faded. In the yellow and black garden, there was but a single man, but that man was as mighty as a statue, and that man was coming down the path, and he was Captain Richard Madden. The future is with us, I replied, but I am your friend. May I look at that letter again? Albert rose once again. He stood tall as he opened the drawer of the tall writing cabinet. He turned his back to me for a moment. I had cocked the revolver. With the utmost care, I fired. Albert fell without a groan, without a sound. On the instant, I swear that he died instantly. One clap of thunder. The rest is unreal, insignificant. Madden burst into the room and arrested me. I have been sentenced to hang. I have most abhorrently triumphed. I have communicated to Berlin the secret name of the city to be attacked. Yesterday it was bombed. I read about it in the same newspapers that posed to all of England the enigma of the murder of the eminent sinologist Stephen Albert, by a stranger, you, soon. The leader solved the riddle. He knew that my problem was how to report, over the deafening noise of the war, the name of the city named Albert, and the only way I could find was murdering a person of that name. He does not know. No, no one can know. My endless contrition and my wariness. Woo! That is a heavy story. I want to thank Jorge Luis Borges and everyone for listening. I'm going to call it tonight. This has been Quarantine Bedtime Storytime, Volume 6, the bonus Borges edition. I'm going to make a little bit of dinner here. I'm wishing everyone good health. Please enjoy the sun this weekend, and I'll see you next time.